Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I'm going to be discussing a little something that you probably noticed if you've been watching my Dominion War series, particularly the Klingon episodes, especially the Battle of Septimus 3, for those of you who have watched it. If you haven't watched the Fall of Septimus 3, there'll be a link, go click it, and then come back to this video. And what you will have probably noticed is that I make quite heavy use of the Norgh Class bird of prey, or the heavy bird of prey from Star Trek Online. At the same time, however, the Klingon K'vort Class bird of prey, the bigger bird of prey, is notably absent from my Dominion War series. Now, why is this? Well, in today's video, I'm going to look at where these ships come from and what ultimately happens to them. But before we get into that, let's go have a little sit down. Look, kid, I see you every day down there at the docks. I know what you're doing. Watching the warships. Let me tell you about a little something. It's called World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play naval warfare game available on PC and consoles. It's constantly updated with fresh content every month. You got over 40 unique maps. Kid, let me tell you, they got warships. We got more ships than you'll ever know what to do with. I'm talking about battleships that break the Washington Naval Treaty. I'm talking destroyers that break all the speed limits. And if you really want to get down and dirty, I know a few submarines that'll show you a good time. All you gotta do to get in on this action, go to the link in the description, download World of Warships, use the code HPPYNWYR2024 to get a free warship, 500 doubloons, 1 million credits, 12 days of premium time, 3 Santa's gift containers, the new Year Constellation flag, and 10 New Year Sky camouflages. That's Hotel, Papa, Yankee, November, Whiskey, Yankee, Romeo. And get yourself some merchandise. Got it? Alright, now get out of here. I don't want to see you down the docks no more. I want to see you playing World of Warships. Okay, so the first thing to really ask is, what is the K'vort? Is the K'vort a heavy bird of prey? And ultimately the answer to that is simply no. It is not a heavy bird of prey. It is quite different from a heavy bird of prey. A heavy bird of prey is basically within the typical size range of a bird of prey. So similar size to a bird of prey, maybe a little bit bigger, but essentially it's just been up-armoured and up-gunned. And it's really still designed to fight in that kind of weight class. When it comes to the history of heavy birds of prey, we can actually go all the way back to the 22nd century. Now, it's greatly up for debate whether or not the bird of prey we see in Enterprise is a heavy bird of prey or just a standard bird of prey, or maybe a standard bird of prey that's over time, had additional weapons added to it. Perhaps originally it didn't have that belly gun, perhaps that was a later addition to increase the firepower to keep it competitive. That's another potential option. So we could talk about the 22nd century bird of prey as a heavy bird of prey, but really we don't have a point of comparison. We don't really have anything to compare it to, so it's not really fair. There's not a base model bird of prey. So really, in order to go and find a heavy bird of prey, we need to go to the late 23rd century, where of course we have the iconic Barrel class bird of prey, and in expanded material we have the D-57 Valkyrie. This is larger than a bird of prey. This has a pair of disruptors mounted on the engines, much like the D7. It then also has 5 medium disruptor turrets and a torpedo launcher. And it did see use in the 2290s, mostly against other Klingon factions as the Empire began to enter a very unstable period. But when it was originally designed, it was simply designed as a heavier unit to support sort of skirmishing elements going out ahead of the main Klingon fleet during an invasion of the Federation. That role was previously occupied by the D6, which was simply just an older, more expendable cruiser, and they wanted to add something that was a little bit more modern, up-to-date, and was better able to support birds of prey by basically just being a bigger, heavier bird of prey. We also see a very interesting prototype in this time period, the D-53 Harbinger. Emphasis here is that this is a prototype, but it does have some very interesting ideas. It very much emphasized its stealth capabilities. This was far more of a stealth and ambush ship than the D-57, and at 240 meters long, it's actually substantially larger than a typical Burrell bird of prey, or even the D-57. So it's probably quite likely that this was the inspiration for a K'vort. It's, probably no coincidence that the K'vort is a similar kind of size. So they were probably looking at the D-53 Harbinger when they were looking for inspiration for the K'vort, and there's reasons for that. So which came first, the Norgh or the Kvort? Well, let's look at what these two ships do. So the thing is that the Norgh exists to outgun other birds of prey, while the Kvort exists as a hunter-killer for Romulan cruisers. Norghs, or proto-Norghs, probably started at some point during the Lost Era, again as descendants ultimately of the D-57. These are very useful little things to have about, particularly if you're anticipating inter-house warfare. But then, of course, the Romulans show up and do what the Romulans do best, kill lots of Klingons. And then suddenly, the Klingons' priorities change from getting ready to fight each other to defending themselves from a very imminent Romulan threat in the form of very, very large and very, very scary Romulan battleships. So that leads them to create the K'vort, which is a perfect counter to things like the Vamalak and Danios, ships which are very, very powerful, but also very, very clumsy and slow. So ultimately, protecting oneself from Romulan attack gained far more priority than preparing yourself for a potential inter-house war. So Norghs were ultimately ignored. Instead, the K'vort was favoured, and there's no point really having a Norgh when you're building K'vorts. What's the point of having a slightly upgunned bird of prey that really just does the same thing as a bird of prey, just slightly better, when you can instead invest that capital into building a large hunter-killer that can take on targets that your birds of prey cannot? So when we get to the Klingon Civil War, it is essentially a war of K'vorts. Each side has K'vorts and has a handful of other cruisers. K'tingas didn't really see use because the Camarag existed, and also the K'vort exists. You don't see K'tingas, and Burrell birds of prey aren't really heavy enough to actually do anything substantial during the Klingon Civil War. This is a war of large cruisers against large cruisers. Fundamentally, what's happening during the Klingon Civil War is you've got a handful of Vocha on Gowron's side, and then a large number of Camarags, a couple of Boreths on the Duras side. And what each side is trying to do is basically get their K'vorts to engage the enemy heavy cruisers, the enemy flagships. So basically you're using your K'vorts to try and get through the enemy and engage and destroy their flagships, their capital ships. That often will result on a K'vort on K'vort duel. So what you end up with by the end of the Klingon Civil War is a substantial depletion of numbers when it comes to the K'vort. A lot of K'vorts were destroyed in the course of the Klingon Civil War. You also have to factor in that after the Civil War, the Vocha goes into full-scale production. Gowron is very keen to reward those who were loyal with Vocha-class cruisers. And the K'vort was also beginning to show its age against the Romulans, bearing in mind, while a couple K'vorts could probably take down a Danios or Vamalak, they were probably going to struggle against a Diduridex. And then you also factor in that the Romulans are also producing the Raptor, almost as a direct response to the Klingon K'vorts. The Raptor is larger and more powerful than K'vorts, and really designed to directly counter them and defend Diduridexes from these smaller kind of hunter-killer style cruisers. So what that ultimately means is that when we get to the Dominion War, the infrastructure that could have been used to produce K'vorts is being allocated instead to producing Vochas, or Boreths, and other various Klingon heavy cruisers. The K'vort as a hunter-killer really doesn't have a place in the large-scale warfare that exists during the Dominion War. The K'vort really just is there to hunt down and destroy enemy capital ships, and is essentially ideal for a what you would call low intensity conflict. They're basically as a defensive ambush vessel, able to strike, when the opportunity arises, but for the most part just kind of sitting and waiting. But the Dominion War doesn't really have any space for a ship like that. The war's going to move too fast for you, and you're going to be left behind. And this is where the heavy bird of prey as a concept once again comes in, and you can look all the way back actually to the D-57 as an example. That ultimately is there to support reconnaissance elements within a Klingon fleet that are going out ahead of the main force of cruisers and help identify targets and penetrate defences. And that's something that a heavy bird of prey like the Norgh is very good at. It's very good in a matchup against other attack ships. It will overwhelm most smaller attack ships. A Norgh is going to have no problem blazing its way through Jem'Hadar fighters. It will have a problem if it's engaged by true enemy destroyers. But what you've then done at that point is you've forced the enemy to commit those destroyers and frigates. Those sort of medium weight ships will generally indicate the overall disposition of a force, and that can be very, very dangerous if they're left unengaged. If you don't engage enemy destroyer formations like the Ryzalak and Sartan, it's much better to engage them and know where they are and force the enemy to commit those assets than leave them free and able to exploit the weaknesses in your own formation. While it might not be fun having to dodge and evade the pulse cannons of a Ryzalak, it's a lot more fun when you know you've got your Vocher backup, because your Vochers aren't worried about being themselves under attack by Ryzalaks and other Cardassian destroyers. So there's a role in a heavy bird of prey simply as something that can take a little bit more of a beating than your average bird of prey, and also just increases the overall firepower of a bird of prey formation. If you go from having just 10 birds of prey to having several Norgs mixed into that formation, you've massively increased the level of firepower that formation is now capable of. And again, you're likely going to be able to achieve an overmatch against formations like Jem'Hadar fighters and Cardassian Hidekis, and maybe even give Lakats a run for their money. Because of that, during the Dominion War, the Norgh really sees its resurgence, and the K'vort is ultimately left behind as a concept. It's very much a concept, but that belongs in that lost era of that period of low intensity conflict that existed between the Klingons and Romulans. So really, when it comes to asking which is better, you have to say that the K'vort is fundamentally just an interesting anomaly. And in terms of its role, you could actually say it's very close to a 22nd century bird of prey, which is more like a heavy frigate. The 22nd century bird of prey is pretty devastating, and it is basically something short of a capital ship, but it's capable of hunting down and pursuing enemy ships far larger than itself because it's just so heavily overgunned. And that's something that it kind of has in common with the K'vort. But fundamentally, it exists for a very specific purpose and is very specialized. It isn't good in a generalist sense. People talk about yesterday's Enterprise and that scenario of a war between the Klingons and the Federation. And actually a matchup between 3 K'vorts and a Galaxy class is kind of perfect. The Klingons are going to love that, particularly an isolated Galaxy class. That's just ideal pickings for K'vorts. But when you start having other ships thrown at you, let's say like New Orleans or Cheyennes, ships that are smaller or similar size but faster and more maneuverable, that's where the K'vort would really, really struggle and would be a bit of a blind spot in Klingon doctrine. And, to an extent, something like the Norgh is much more capable of closing those blind spots in Klingon doctrine, in making birds of prey more than just sort of skirmish and cannon fodder units, giving them some real punching power. Vessels like the Norgh, heavy birds of prey, upgunned Klingon vessels, appear actually quite regularly throughout Klingon history in various forms. And it is an age-old adage: if one gun isn't enough, use more gun. They're much easier to manufacture than something like a K'vort. They're smaller, cheaper. You're using a reliable, tested, known chassis and giving it a boost in firepower. And also, because it is being built on a pre-existing chassis, it's also pre-adapted for the conditions you find yourself in. Smaller ships, ships basically, if you think about it like nature, further down the food chain, they are of course better able to adapt to changing circumstances than the larger apex predators. And really, in terms of that generalist role, the Norgh fits that the best, and is arguably the best adapted, not just for the Dominion War, but really for any kind of future circumstances that might arise, and for any future conflicts that the Empire might find itself embroiled in. There's always going to be a place for the Norgh. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring this video, and I will see you all in the next video.